Hello, my name is Kennedy Moore with the Center for Presidential History here at SMU. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Benjamin Johnson. Dr. Johnson is a professor at Loyola University Chicago with an emphasis in environmental history, North American borders, and Latino history. Dr. Johnson will be joining us on campus on March 4th from 6 to 7:30 in McCord Auditorium to discuss his new book, In Texas, An American History. Thank you, Dr. Johnson, for being here with me today.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So the first question I have for you is what even got you interested in this topic? What was the ideation process that brought you to this point that is extremely unique and you don't necessarily see when discussing Texas history in general?
Well, in some ways, I've always been interested in Texas history, right? From growing up there, school field trips to the Alamo, Go Texan days, the seventh grade version of Texas history. And when I moved to other states, it was confusing to me. I'm like, why isn't, the Minnesota flag or the Connecticut flag or the Illinois flag like being hung everywhere? I don't even know what those flags look like. Longstanding interest, just from my own childhood and understanding the past of the place where I grew up. And, as Texans are kind of steeped in their own history, but it's a history that's often told in a very distinctive way. And so, particularly, it's focused so heavily on the 19th century, right? And the countryside. But, by the time I grew up, most people in Texas, like Americans in general, lived in cities and suburbs, right? They lived in places like Dallas and Denton. And we don't necessarily have a history that kind of prepares us to understand that world of modern Texas. So there's a big emphasis on the 20th century and on modern practices, the development of Texas Instruments and the superconductor, the development of video games, modern marketing and sports franchises like the Dallas Cowboys, the the Whole Foods company, which just has an enormous impact on American grocery retail in general. So yeah, so it's both, kind of a long-standing interest and commitment to Texas history and love for Texas history, but also the sense that most of the big stories we tell about Texas are kind of incomplete and don't necessarily, and in a way, like kind of underestimate its impact, particularly on the modern world.
Okay. Following that tangent of storytelling, you discuss how in your book that the history is so vast and complex that retellings are inevitable to evolve into selective storytelling. As a
Mhm.
historian, how do you navigate the ethics of deciding what to include or omit? And does that selectivity, um, it obviously does play into a broader historical pattern that like uplifts and promotes like white supremacy and the erasure of minority stories. So is that like inherently a challenge of historical writing of like maintaining the balance of absolute truth while maintaining audience engagement?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I mean, this is one of the big struggles I had, or one of the big challenges I had in writing this book. Of course, I'm obligated as a historian to tell the truth, right, and to only make assertions that I can back up with evidence. But as your question points out, the totality of Texas history is so enormous, that you have to actually make decisions about what to talk about and what not to talk about, and whose stories to tell and whose stories not to tell. So I think the first thing is to just embrace that sense that, I, as an author, and I, as a historian, have to make those decisions, right? And they're inherent to the practice. They're inherent to the practice of history. Even an 800-page book, which was published a few years ago on Texas history, it's enormous. It's, maybe four times the size of the book that I've written. But even that leaves stuff out, right? I mean, you've got a country-size state of nearly 30 million people with a crazy and variegated history. So I guess I looked for two things. I mean, one, I looked for kind of a sense of balance and representation, right? Um, so, in 1861, when Texas secedes from the United States, a third of its population is black, right? Almost all of whom are enslaved. It's crazy if you tell a history of Texas up to 1861 and don't have anything to say about the lives and of those people and their decisions and their experiences. Not only does that uh, um, show a disrespect to them, but you just can't understand Texas as a whole if you don't understand the role of the institution of slavery in Texas, just to pick one example. And that does point, I think, then to the second criteria, right, which is the sense of I want to pick certain particular moments, particular events, and particular characters, explain them a little bit, and the hope is that I can use them in each chapter to kind of illuminate a larger landscape and to suggest some of its contours without necessarily going into any great detail.
So I wanted to ask you, um, many Americans see Texas through like a mythologized like events like the Alamo. And so in your research, what are some of the biggest misconceptions about Texas and history? And like what stories or figures do you think deserve more recognition, or like maybe a favorite story of yours that's often not highlighted and seen in like history books?
In terms of biggest misconceptions, um, we all know the sort of center of the mythology of Texas history is the Texas Revolution, right? The settlement of Anglo-Americans, um, uh, of course, a third of whom are the enslaved laborers that they bring, as a matter of fact, and the split with Mexico and the birth of Texas as an independent republic and its existence for 9 years before joining the United States. And, these are incredibly dramatic events, right? Like it's hard to make up a better story for drama and pathos than the Alamo. And they deserve to be told and they deserve to be known. At the same time, I think that the misconception at work is the sense that when people who aren't Mexican show up in the territory of Mexico, that the seeds for secession and revolution are already planted. And so I try to use the life of Stephen F. Austin and draw on some very fine scholarship about Austin to show how successfully integrated into Mexican political and cultural life he was for more than a decade. So he becomes fluent in Spanish. He becomes socially very close to the Seguins and a number of other leading Texas Mexican families. And he pledges his loyalty to Mexico, which was incredibly good to him, made him wealthy, made him prominent, and goes so far as to actually lead military forces in the suppression of a failed revolt, not too many years before he becomes a partisan of the Texas Revolution. He was known by Esteban, right, rather than Stephen. So I think he's actually a fascinating, he's a central character in the classic story of Texas history. And I think he's like even more interesting because in a way he was a central actor for another story, which was about Mexico's ability to incorporate diverse people, into its polity. Um, in terms of kind of mythology and things that aren't generally talked about with respect to Texas history that we don't often associate with Texas, I would actually point to matters of gender and sexuality, right? And the two most consequential Supreme Court cases in modern times to deal with those are Roe versus Wade, which in 1973 struck down restrictions or most restriction, created a federal right to have an abortion. And then the Obergefell decision, which legalized same-sex marriage. And amazingly, both of those Supreme Court decisions have their root in Texas and went through the law offices of a particular attorney, a graduate of Baylor University's law school in East Dallas in the early 1970s, and they changed so many things about American culture and American politics, and they're just like that as a category, right? Gay rights or sexuality. This is not something that people generally associate with Texas, but I think they should.
So you write that Texas means something to millions of people across the world. Your book highlights histories that many have never encountered, stories that complicate and enrich the traditional Lone Star narrative, stories that people like ultimately end up falling in love with the idea of the Wild Wild West, Texas. So, what are the consequences of shifting the focus to these often overlooked perspectives, and how does removing the rose tinted glasses alter the way people perceive Texas? And does reframing um, this idea align with your broader mission as a historian that focuses in the Southwest region?
I mean, in some way, that's thanks again for this question. In some ways, that's up to how people respond to the book.
Yeah.
I can have my intentions, but there's a way in which readers really own the book, right?
Yeah.
Really make what its meaning is. I guess, I do try to sort of puncture some illusions and tell some stories that I hope readers will find disturbing, because they are disturbing. I
Mhm.
don't mess around with like the institution of slavery and the importance of anti-black racism and mob violence to the making of Texas in the 19th and especially the first half of the 20th century. And some of those stories are just they're really disturbing, right? It's really the chapter where I talk about the horrific 1916 lynching of Jesse Washington in Waco. I mean, even to write that and to kind of assume the perspective of a mob that, rips this human being apart and celebrates this awful act, like, it's a century later and I'm not targeted by these things, and it's disturbing to write about them. And I hope that the way I wrote about them disturbs a reader. But that's not the only element, right? That's not the only ingredient in this cake, and um, those are leavened with other stories, that are much more optimistic. I guess what I'm trying to do in some of these other stories is to show the ways in which all kinds of people had a deep attachment to Texas and kind of articulated their own and enacted their own version of Texanness, right? So, even on this count of race, I mean, I think Juneteenth is one of the most interesting ways in which Texas has shaped the larger commemorative landscape. So it's one of a very select set of federal holidays. And, it obviously, as you know, it marks the story of emancipation, the destruction of the institution of slavery, which I think is the single most important event to happen in the history of the United States. But it captures a sense of ambiguity, right? The sense that this comes several years later, after the fact. I think that's one of the reasons it's such a powerful story, is that it highlights what a turning point the destruction of slavery was, but also the sense that it doesn't change, that it doesn't change everything. But you have people in San Francisco celebrating Juneteenth and riding up the main drag in downtown San Francisco on a horse with a white cowboy hat, celebrating emancipation and in a sense celebrating their own sense of freedom. Um, and then there are other stories, including about the Methodist Church and Methodist denominations and the kind of extraordinary flowering of cultural institutions after the Civil War as an effort to kind of tame a really violent landscape and violent place. So in the end, I'm not out to disillusion people about the totality of Texas history. I mean, I actually want people to, in a sense, take it more seriously, right? Take it seriously as international history, take it seriously as something that's shaped the modern world. But sometimes that's in really disturbing ways, and I try to capture that too. Which, I just think that's the way the world is, right?
Yeah.
It's a large, complicated place. It would be really strange to write a history of a state that is larger in population and extent than most countries on planet Earth and not have a kind of mix of the good, the bad, and the ugly. And, I hope that's what people see in my book.
Absolutely. I love that. So your book suggests that Texas has shaped many aspects of American culture, from food, politics to technology. What do you think? Why do you think that Texas has such an outsized influence on the rest of the country? And what about its history or identity makes it so uniquely powerful?
So yeah, another another great question. Why does it have such a powerful influence? I mean, I guess I would point to two reasons. I think they're pretty straightforward. One is simply the size of the place, right?
Yeah.
Geographically, and population wise, this is, the only state that rivals its importance on the modern United States is California. So it's, a state that's the leading cotton producer in the nation. It becomes the leading petroleum producer in the nation. It's the state through the 1950s that had the largest Mexican descent population of any state in the United States. It's one of the key places for the birth of the modern petrochemical industry. And in terms of cultural trends and voting trends, just when you have a state that's that large, it's going to have ripple effects on the rest of the country. So it makes sense that the Bush family looked away from Connecticut and Massachusetts and looked to Texas as a place to sort of reinvent themselves and to rearticulate their centrality in the post-World War II and the post-World War II United States. So size and scope, I think, are a big part of the factor. But I think the second factor is the kind of mythos of Texas gives it an even more outsized impact on American culture. And there, I don't think there's another state that on the cultural landscape has anything like the reputation of Texas. So, yeah, I think those two factors help explain why it's been so extraordinarily influential on the larger course of national history.
I absolutely agree. So I have one last question for you, and this is like the fun question that I like to ask everybody. So if you had to pitch your lecture to maybe a finance or trumpet performance major, just somebody that's not typically interested in history, what would be the one thing that you would want to say to them to have them sit down for an hour and listen to your lecture?
So first of all, I'd tell them I'm not going to talk for an hour. It'd be more like 30, 40 minutes, lots of questions and answers. But that's a great question. Let me think. I guess I would tell them that I think, or I hope, I guess would be more modest, that I hope they will see some explanation for their own life, right? If they have some connection to Texas, either growing up there or just going to SMU, going to school there, and that I will reinforce the sense that Texas is really big and really important, but in some unpredictable ways and in some really like strange ways. So truth is stranger than fiction, I guess, is the bottom line for me.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Johnson. For all those that are listening today, come and join us on March 4th from 6 to 7:30 in McCord Auditorium to hear directly from Dr. Johnson about his book. Thank you so much for having me today.
Thanks so much, Kennedy. Appreciate it.
Thank you.